Hi everybody, welcome to the module on Buddhism. Now, it's often said that Buddhism is more of a philosophy than a religion, and there are certain truths to that. A lot of what we look at today is going to remind us of philosophical questions. When we think of our assumptions of Buddhism, we see that questions are posed as to what the existence we are living is or who we are. And these are often questions that are asked philosophically within the realm of metaphysics, within the realm of ethics. And Buddhism is going to kind of follow that tradition through our understanding of what there is. Buddhism is going to sort of tell us how to behave versus other religions that we looked at earlier in this class that would often prescribe some certain behavior based on what God says, for instance, or what a certain deity says. And so when we think about Buddhism, we're going to see a sort of mix between a lot of the Western traditions that we looked at earlier in this class, but then we'll obviously see similarities with Hinduism since Buddhism uh, arrives out of Hinduism. And so the main focus, the main character of Buddhism is Siddhartha Gautama. The awakened one is what the translation of Buddha translates to. And for the Buddha, we can all become awakened. Everybody can become awakened. It doesn't necessarily matter what caste you're in. We'll see later that Buddhism is kind of a response to Hinduism and the caste system. It doesn't matter what gender you're in. But the Buddha is really the first to reach enlightenment, the first to enter into that mindset of nirvana. And so after he achieves this state, he spends the rest of his life teaching others his particular path, which is not going to be the only path, but he'll be teaching his particular path to this state. And so Siddhartha was born in 563 BCE. He was a wealthy Hindu prince. He was part of the Kshatriyas and lived a pretty luxurious life. He was showered with riches, wealth. He had a wife and a son. And he was often believed to be very sheltered. He didn't really have a keen understanding of the atrocities or the suffering in the world. And this is going to play an important role in his teachings, in his philosophy, and the Buddhist way of life. And because he lived this sheltered life and didn't really see the different sufferings, he didn't really have a good appreciation for the world around him. And so at a certain point in his life, he leaves the palace, he leaves the town he lives, and experiences for the first time types of kind of suffering in the world. And this is quite overwhelming for him. And so through this kind of suffering, through this experience, he comes to the realization that having an abundance of wealth is not going to help us understand our place in the world. So if we think back to last module, we think back to Hinduism, and Hinduism is all about getting back to Brahman, trying to uh, understand Atman's role in the world, understand that kind of soul and essence in the world, understand your place in the world and how your place is a part of this interconnected whole. So Siddhartha sets off on this quest to find this sense of nirvana, find this release, this oneness with the universe. And it's not through riches that we're going to get there. In addition, it's also not from necessarily relinquishing all types of attachments and relationships, and essentially a life of asceticism. Uh, Remember, with the Hindu tradition, meditation and asceticism, this idea that we're essentially going to starve ourselves, uh, create a sense of emptiness in our world is a key foundation. And while that's also going to be the case for Buddhism, Siddhartha Buddha is going to kind of transform that idea and express a more middle path between excess and a deficiency. And he's going to refer to that as the middle path. And by acknowledging and acting in accordance with that middle path, we will be able to release ourselves from samsara, from the cycle of life, and reach that state of nirvana. And so he believed in this middle path because, again, he thought that neither a life of luxury or asceticism, so having everything and having nothing, doesn't actually address suffering in the world. And so he believed that all actions must be done in moderation. And this is something that is quite common in Western philosophy. Aristotle also believed in this idea of the happy medium, that our behavior should be guided not by vices or excess or deficiency, but also by um, kind of a happy medium, right? It would be foolish to rush into war without fear. Similarly, it would be quite cowardice to kind of hide away and cry in the fetal position during conflict. And so, for Aristotle, an idea of bravery or the virtue of bravery would be somewhere on the middle point of a spectrum of foolishness, right? Running into battle not afraid versus cowardice. And Siddhartha's position is quite similar. He saw that uh, through meditation, um, Hindus would essentially be starving themselves. And this idea was not a very good one to him. With a malnourished body, with a malnourished mind, one could not meditate, and understanding one's place in the world is quite hindered by that. And so he believed that we ought to uh, eat to have things in order to sustain our lives, but not necessarily in excess, and to certainly not let those things in our lives kind of take hold of us or guide us. And so, after leaving his Hindu society, his Hindu counterparts, he uh, went away, and we see an image of the Buddha meditating under the infamous Bodhi tree. And it is under this tree that he reaches nirvana, becomes the Buddha, and gains that kind of complete control and clarity, that sense of nirvana that we talked about last module, uh, and really relinquishes himself from the suffering, from the desires and attachments that are going to be similar with Buddhism and Hinduism. And so, just like Hinduism, there's this understanding of an enlightenment, a way to kind of settle the mind, to release oneself from the cycle of life. And it demonstrates, reaching this enlightenment demonstrates one's control over one's mind and one's circumstances, to be able to relinquish those attachments, relinquish the desires, and to really be able to just gain control of the mind. And so, one of the key aspects of Buddhism are three marks. And these three marks are essentially what we would kind of call truisms. They are ideas, they're propositions of sort that are just axiomatically true according to the Buddhist religion. And so they're not necessarily Buddhist ideas, but just gathered up, they're considered by Buddhists as the three marks, and they're going to be anicca, dukkha, and anatta. So anicca is essentially the impermanence of the world. Everything is impermanent and nothing is permanent. And so everything is in constant flux. Everything is changing. We often hear of the saying, the only constant is change. And that is this idea. Again, an idea that comes about in Western philosophy roughly around this time, shortly thereafter, that the world is just pure movement, the world is ever changing, and there is no such thing as constant. And for the Buddha, this is where suffering arises from. The idea that we have these type of illusory attachments to things, that we can attach ourselves to things, because if the world is ever changing, we won't ever be able to hold on to these attachments. We can't actually possess things because at some point that will change, right? At some point, love ends when one of the people dies. Wealth ends when somebody dies or somebody can go bankrupt, right? And so we see that all of these different areas within life are ever changing. And so this illusion of our attachment is something that causes suffering and also something that we need to kind of distance ourselves from. Which brings us to the next mark, and that is dukkha, right? The suffering, and that life is suffering. That desire, that need to be attached comes about in one's life, and it's essentially our goal to try and distance ourselves, to try and get out of this life of suffering. And when I mean get out, I don't mean like to end your life, but to reach this state of nirvana that relinquishes one from this cycle of suffering and samsara and really gets us back to this original position, uh, this unification of the universe. And so suffering essentially pervades all of our experiences. Last is the anatta, and it's really the Buddhist concept of Atman, but slightly different in that for Buddhists, it's more of a non self. And this kind of goes back to the difficulty with understanding kind of Eastern versus Western thought, right? If we think of the non self or we think of a no self, it's difficult to picture, right? It's difficult to suggest that here is this thing, but this thing is nothing. This thing is empty. But this idea is important for Buddhism because this is going to be essentially the reincarnated element that continues. It's going to be this sense of non-self, this kind of consciousness, mental formations type of identity that doesn't really have any kind of form or structure to it. But this is going to be the thing that essentially, right, that we tame, the thing that is really brought back to the unification or oneness of the universe. And so we often think at our core about this nothingness, this consciousness, and these ways in which we experience being, what our reality is. And so we often cling to this and try to, through not just the Buddha's method, but our own individual path, is to really open up and get our Buddha self, right? Get this nothingness, this no self, this illusory self, um, to relieve ourselves from it, to relieve ourselves from a sense of self. Because in Buddhism, it's just an illusion to have that sense of self. Because remember, everything is always changing, nothing is permanent. And so we need to relinquish ourselves from a feeling of independence and recognize our interconnectedness with the universe. And so, again, I mentioned the idea that Buddhism is very much a challenge to the Hindu caste system. And so we understand Dharma in Hinduism as essentially the duty one has. If you're going to be a trash collector, then your Dharma is to be the best damn trash collector there is. If you're a wife, then your Dharma is to be the best wife that you can be. But Dharma in Buddhism doesn't necessarily determine one's path as it does in Hinduism. In Buddhism, rather than living according to your duty, rather living according to what that kind of caste level is, in Buddhism, one must determine for him or herself what their own dharma is, what their own duty essentially is. So when we look at the similarities and differences between Buddhism and Hinduism, we see that according to the caste and this idea of dharma, with Buddhism, it's less strict or less prescribed than we see in Hinduism, that's very rigid, it's very, here are the rules, here is the duty of yours, you must follow this, so that you might become reincarnated into a higher being in the next life. Um, this is not going to be the case with Buddhism. Buddhism, you are being reincarnated as well. You might not reach nirvana right away, but it is this kind of uh, consciousness that is being reincarnated, and that consciousness may not necessarily rise up or down in social institutions. And so when we think of Dharma in Buddhism, we think of it more as one's own individual path to get to that state of nirvana rather than a specific duty belonging to some sort of social order. And so in Buddhism, the Buddha taught essentially a community of other monks this path to enlightenment. And so after the Buddha reached this sense of nirvana, reached this enlightenment, he essentially was able to teach and ordain men as monks, women as nuns, and help lead them to their own path or help lead them and teach them what might become their path to this state of nirvana, to this release. And so after the death of the Buddha, there was no successor, there was no required leader. It was more along the lines of each person was required to find his or her path, regardless of the existence or the whether or not the Buddha was alive or not. And so after his death, people were still faced with that task of finding their own individual path. And so the main teachings of Buddha revolved around essentially the Four Noble Truths, which will include the Eightfold Path, and really focuses on the theme of compassion. And so when we think of this Four Noble Truths, which include the Eightfold Path, we can think of the Four Noble Truths as being similar to a medical diagnosis for a particular disease. And so when we think of Four Noble Truths, we're thinking of them in terms of identifying what's wrong with the world, what's going on, perhaps what it means for the world to be problematic, or whether or not what it means to have a specific issue. Is there a way of release, or is there a cure to this problem? And then what is the prescribed action for doing that? And so if we think toward a medical diagnosis, right, if we discover a disease or a virus, let's say, right, we might think to ourselves, okay, well, what are before we know that there's a virus, we see that there are these symptoms. And once we start to understand the symptoms, we then start to understand what is causing the symptoms. So from the symptoms, we get the disease. After we've identified the disease, we can then look for whether or not, or determine whether or not there is a particular cure for that disease. Once we've determined that, we are able to prescribe treatment to fight this virus or overcome the disease. This is going to be the essence of the Four Noble Truths. So when we look at the Four Noble Truths, we're thinking of them in terms of this medical diagnosis. So one, the symptom is suffering in the world. So we look around and we see the suffering. We experience the suffering, the idea of a loss because of this illusion of self, this illusion of attachment. And from that, this the cause, or what is causing this suffering, is essentially our desires in the world. We desire things, and then we can either not get those things, which will cause suffering, or we can get those things and then work really hard to hold on to them, but eventually lose them, which will cause suffering as well. And so to live is to experience suffering, which is the symptom. The cause of that, right? That what the disease is desire. And there is, in fact, a treatment to that. There is a cure to fighting off the desire. And that treatment is the Eightfold Path. Now, remember, for the Buddha, this Eightfold Path is part of his path to get to this state. It is not necessarily what everybody must follow, but we'll see here in a minute that the Eightfold Path is essentially a kind of guidelines for how to act, right? It is behavioral, ethical. It is about how our actions will lead us to relinquish ourselves from a world of desire, and therefore escape that suffering and reach that state of nirvana. So the guidelines that one must follow according to this Eightfold Path is really along the lines of the middle path, right? Again, thinking back to ancient Greece and Aristotle, which actually came after the Buddha, but when we think back to this, which might be more familiar, right, we think of that happy medium. We don't want to go in excess of one way or the other. Life is about living this happy medium. And when we think about living this happy medium, this will lead us to our state of nirvana. It will lead us out of samsara. And so we can see certain similarities between Buddhism and perhaps Protestantism in Christianity. Remember the difference between Protestantism and the Roman Catholic Church at the time was that for Protestants, it was all about faith, while the Roman Catholic Church was both faith and acts. And so it's through our faith, through our own understanding, through our own path to God, we are able to repair or restore that relationship. In Buddhism, through our own path, we are able to reach samsara. And so, or reach this state of nirvana and escape from samsara. And so the first of the Eightfold Path is to have the right sort of views. Essentially, adhere to or accept the idea that the Four Noble Truths are a thing, right? Obviously, if there's no acceptance that the world is suffering, if there's no um, thought, if there's no acceptance that the suffering can be relinquished through the elimination of desire, then this won't necessarily make sense in terms of uh, a particular path to lead to any uh, potential state. Instead, it would just be a kind of ethical process or a position we can hold to behave a certain way. After that, it's essentially having the right thought or the right intent, right? We should avoid negative thoughts, thoughts like anger or greed, foolishness, jealousy, right? These things are negative, and instead we want to focus our attention on more positive type thoughts, such as compassion. And so having that right thought will again make us better people, will make us have clearer minds, will allow us to control our minds better and allow us to reach that state of nirvana. And so, after having that right kind of thought, it's important that we have the right sort of speech as well. Um, don't lie. Don't speak falsely about others or speak badly about others. Don't speak uselessly. Don't just speak because you want to, right? Uh, this type of behavior, again, is going to help one become that kind of a more ethical, more awakened person to be able to cultivate their consciousness. In addition, having the right conduct, no killing, no stealing, ambushing, or consuming intoxicants, right? Because these things all harm the idea, again, of an ethical self or an ethical behavioral tendency. They harm our ability to control our consciousness, our awakened mind, and so forth. 5 is to have the right livelihood. Do not harm others or get ahead by seeking what is more necessary in life than what is needed. So you don't want to push others down so that you can go up. Essentially, we should be happy with the things that we have. We should not necessarily need or not desire more than we need to really uh, stay alive and live. So the right effort, number 6, make sure you're doing the right thing and avoiding evil thoughts. Number 7, have that right mindfulness. So there's going to be this level of kind of meditation um, one must practice to rise above these desires. And I mean, we can think about this for ourselves uh, if we try to rise above the desires of pleasure or wanting something, it's very quite difficult and requires a kind of trained mind to kind of shut down those desires. And then right concentration, obviously, will allow us to work for that highest form of meditation. So not only that we, through meditation, will we get to nirvana, but through cultivating that, um, through getting to that highest form of meditation and contemplation, are we able to lift ourselves out of this illusory, attached version of the world and reach that state of nirvana and oneness. And so, while most Buddhists follow this, again, remember it's not something that is necessarily or not necessarily um, every single Buddhist prescribes these same exact rules. These are just kind of the basics for what cultivates a stronger mind and a good person. And we can see this as a difference from, let's say, the Ten Commandments in Judaism, where it's essentially the rules um, ushered down by God that we must follow. These particular rules do not come from a greater source of power. They do not come from a omniscient God. Instead, these are just the ways in which we can help cultivate that kind of mental state and consciousness to reach a more awakened, enlightened uh, path. And so, again, going back to this idea of the self and Atman, Buddhism versus Hinduism, Buddhists essentially reject this idea of Atman as an unchanging pure self, because remember, this kind of flies in contradiction to the idea of a oneness, the idea of unification of everything. If there's going to be a self, then there's something independent, let's say, of the ultimate um, kind of oneness. So it's difficult for the Hindu to really show the separation between Atman and Brahman, and then its reunification. And so Buddhism at its core is this kind of idea that there is no self, there is this emptiness, and we ought to recognize, realize that um, through relinquishing ourselves through these different attachments and desires, so to reach this cultivated, more aware state of the interconnectedness of the universe. And so, for Buddhists, one couldn't possess a self independent or unique, because there is no self, there is nothing other than that kind of unification or interconnectedness of everything. As far as texts come into play, there are a few texts that we're going to look at here. They are quite different from the texts that we've looked at in previous religions, such as the Torah or the Bible or the Quran. Instead, the sacred texts of Buddhism are, well, they're written after the life of Buddhism, or after the life of the Buddha, which is similar to other religions. But essentially, they just kind of recount teachings or establish rules or talk about philosophical reflections. They don't usher in the Word of God or express the Word of God or an ultimate being. And so, one of the first, the Pitaka, the Sutra Pitaka, is essentially a kind of discourse. Um, Sayings attributed to the Buddha, um, just kind of literature that contains actual teachings and stories from the Buddha of previous lives. And so, again, it's important to note that even though these texts are teaching the Buddha's words or teachings, the Buddha himself expresses this idea that there are many paths to the same place. And so, following to the T necessarily these teachings is not necessarily going to get one to the state of nirvana. Instead, it's just a way that he did it. And so we can see a difference here between, let's say, this sutra and the Quran, which is the word of God, believed to be the word of God, and that these particular prescriptions ought to be followed because of the divine origination. The second, the Vinaya Pitaka, is basically just rules for establishing different monasteries that were attributed to the Buddha. Remember, after the Buddha reaches his state of nirvana, he then creates this community of monks and nuns to help lead them to this similar state. And so, really, just kind of laying out different rules, guidelines of behavior, um, what age one should be ordained, how one should recite different rules, different relationships between teacher and student, and things like that. Again, they are prescriptions by the Buddha for the community, but again, not necessarily perhaps as infallible as we might see um, text for the Quran. The last is um, more of the philosophical text, the more philosophical aspects about Buddhism, the teachings about um, how we engage with the nature of consciousness. So very kind of philosophy of mind, philosophy of consciousness, understanding of the cosmology, understanding meditation. So really kind of understanding how these things work, what they mean, their importance and their relevance, and so forth. And this is going to be perhaps the earliest of the texts in Buddhism, and um, really interprets the Buddha's teachings quite philosophically. And so, like many of the Western religions that we looked at, there are going to be different denominations. Remember, Hinduism kind of worked in reverse. It started out as multiple denominations that eventually become unified into one religion. Meanwhile, when we look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, we see the origination of this teaching, this religion, this idea, and then from that, we see different perspectives and then different branching off of the original idea. And so the Theravada Buddhism is going to be perhaps the more traditional form of Buddhism. And there's no real sacred text here. Um, Multiple interpretations about how to be, how to reach this awakened state, right? How to become a Buddha, how to become an awakened one. And it created this idea of a monasticism again, with the Buddha taking monks and nuns under his wing and teaching them the way. So Theravada Buddhism kind of focuses its attention on these monasteries to meditate and teach the community, but also keep a kind of uh, political, social institutions in check by kind of reaching out beyond necessarily just to the kind of individual path, the individual um, quest to reach this particular awakened state. So Theravada Buddhism really focuses its orientation on a kind of a transcendental path through this idea of meditation that's typically reserved for monks. So again, kind of compare this to a Roman Catholic, the denomination of Roman Catholics. We see a very kind of um, hierarchy. We see um, meditation reserved typically for monks and monasteries, so not necessarily geared towards the layperson. And this idea of a karma being merit-based, actions will improve rebirth rather than perhaps that kind of consciousness, that um, relinquishing of desires and attachments. And so we would think that the person that achieves nirvana, who becomes released from this cycle, right, the worthy one, kind of has that hierarchy above those who are lower down on the process for reaching this mental state or achievement. Next is Mahayana Buddhism. Um, and this is going to be probably the most popular form of Buddhism, the most widespread. And this is a kind of a response to that very kind of orthodox version of Buddhism. And the goal here is not necessarily to reach that state of nirvana. Instead, the goal is to bring nirvana to all beings. And so we get the term, the great vehicle, again, the Mahayana, and we understand this type of bodhisattva, which is going to be an awakened being, but one that essentially forgoes that release in order to help others get to this state of nirvana. And so rather than just have that kind of individualistic, the goal is to reach nirvana, for the Mahayans, it's to get others to reach as well and to bring nirvana to everyone. And so if I get to this state or right on the precipice of the state, I might withhold in order to essentially allow certain desires and attachments to bring others up, so that everybody can reach this particular state and be liberated. And so with the Mahayans, it's a focus on meditation, not necessarily text, focusing on text. Again, think back to kind of Protestants. We're not going to necessarily rely on the rituals. We're not going to rely on the monasteries. It's basically your own path that will really allow one to reach this state of a bodhisattva, and gain this kind of awakened thought, but kind of pulled back a little so that we can then try and usher it into others as well. Zen Buddhism is perhaps one of the most popular in the United States. Again, another denomination that focuses heavily on meditation. But Zen Buddhism rejects formal teachings from the Buddha. A quote is attributed to Zen Buddhists: "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." This isn't literal, obvious. It's more along the lines of, don't let, like, even the Buddha, right, the first to reach nirvana, the first awakened one, even if he were to say something about the Eightfold Path or the process to reaching nirvana, this is no help to you. You must do this yourself. And so even authority figures we shouldn't listen to. And again, not authority figures like don't listen to the police. It's more like if a monk or someone who has reached this enlightened position were to say something that may not necessarily apply to you or others. And so everyone must find their own path. And for Zen Buddhists, it's very much a universal kind of everyone is capable of doing this. So again, as a response to Hinduism, we can see for Zen Buddhism this idea that, well, it doesn't matter what caste you're in, it doesn't matter male or female, monk or nun, everybody can experience nirvana. And so it's really open to everyone, and it is everybody's own path to make. And nobody else, not even the Buddha, can say otherwise. And so when we think of this process, there are these koans, these paradoxical riddles that will help us, in a sense, kind of throw out that rational mind that may prohibit us from reaching this state of nirvana. Essentially, they're paradoxical riddles that will exhaust the mind so that we focus less on the rational aspects and more on the intuitive aspects of consciousness, awareness, and so forth. Some of these riddles you may have heard before. I can particularly remember One example being expressed on The Simpsons a long time ago, when Lisa asks Bart to contemplate the sound of one hand clapping. And you see him trying to clap one hand, right? But that isn't exactly the idea in Buddhism. It's more of just to understand or not understand, uh, throw away that rational part of your mind to allow the intuitive, allow the intuition to come forth. Next is Vajrayana Buddhism, which is essentially the diamond vehicle. And this is going to be very similar to the Mahayana Buddhism, but with a hierarchy. Um, and on top of this hierarchy, someone that you may be familiar with is the Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama here is going to be that kind of revered um, top person within this denomination. And so bodhisattvas, uh, like in Mahayanan, like in Zen Buddhism, are not necessarily Mahayana Buddhism, not Zen Buddhism, are going to be kind of higher up on the totem pole than others might be. And so um, here we can just see a little bit more about this particular denomination. And again, the Dalai Lama is a part of this tradition of teachers, and that um, this idea of a teacher is to return to the world and bring others to enlightenment. So again, think of this idea of a bodhisattva and preventing oneself from getting there in order to bring others. And so this is kind of what the Dalai Lama is doing, right? The Dalai Lama is continually being reborn in order to teach, to usher in this sense of nirvana and get everyone to understand this idea of nirvana. Lastly, is the Pure Land Buddhism, um, essentially a denomination that understands a kind of godlike Buddha that arises long after the Buddha. Um, I see God lie. There's a typo here. I will make sure to fix that. But essentially, um, it's this kind of coming of the Buddha, uh, almost this kind of second coming of the Buddha, will grant one access to the pure land or the happy land, this state of nirvana, which is a pretty popular form of Buddhism, especially to the laity. So people might think um, that at some point they'll be saved essentially. So it often appeases those that have the fears and insecurities that people typically have in this world, but as a denomination that kind of believes that again there will be this eventual time where there will be an ushering in of this unification of the universe, and we will be brought there by the Amida Buddha.